Hey fellas, welcome to Guys in Grief, sponsored by Emma's Footprints and First Candle. We started this podcast for fathers like us that have experienced pregnancy or infant loss. You see, when we went through these life-changing experiences, we struggled to find resources that were specifically for men in support of navigating this grieving process. We're not doctors, we're not psychiatrists, we're three friends. We're grieving fathers that have been through the unthinkable and want to help others by talking about the unique and often undiscussed perspective of men that have experienced child loss. We welcome you to join us on this journey. Share your stories, the challenges, laugh with us, maybe shed a tear or two, and help each other as we navigate honoring our children, grief, supporting our family, and trying to find better days ahead. Let's get into it. Well, hey everyone, and welcome to an incredibly special episode of Guys in Grief. As you just heard in our introduction, we very notably call out that we are not doctors, we are not psychiatrists, and if you've listened to any of the episodes, we are certainly not priests. But with that, we value the incredible impact and perspective that each of these professions have on lost parents. So today, we'll hear from some experts in each of these fields. From people that have personally touched our lives and supported us through our grief journey. So we hope you enjoy our conversations with Father Sam Kachuba, Dr. Jason Fernasiak, and grief counselor Pamela Pressler. Brian, take it away.
Well, I'm so excited about this episode. You nailed it right on the head, Brad. You know, this is a unique episode for us. I think we have been listening to a lot of our guests and gathering feedback. And I'm so honored to introduce Father Sam of St. Pius Church in Fairfield, which is our church that my wife Lindsay and I and our family attends in Fairfield. Father Sam has been with St. Pius since 2006. Is that in some capacity, according to your bio? But anybody that listened to my episode would know Father Sam was so important to Lindsay and I in our healing, in our grieving. He really was there for us. I'll let him tell the story a little bit, but he didn't really know Lindsay and I when he got the call that we lost Austin, and he did not hesitate to meet with us and to spend time with us over the following months after we lost Austin to, make sure we were okay. So without further ado, Father Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. That's a really nice intro, Brian. I appreciate that. That's really nice of you.
Well, you mean a lot to Lindsay and I, so we really appreciate you joining.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Father Sam.
It's definitely mutual. Thanks, Brad. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and, the St. Pius.
Yeah, so I'm a priest now 15 years. I was actually, my connection to St. Pius goes back to 2006 when I was there as a seminarian for the summer, just kind of doing my observation and on-the-job training. And then I was ordained and was assigned to St. Pius, and then went back to school for a little bit, was reassigned to St. Pius again when I finished, and then was transferred for a couple of years and then came back in 2015 as pastor. So yeah, I can't get away from this place.
Yeah, well, I'm thankful for that, or else we wouldn't have met.
Yeah, it's a really great place, and I'm really fortunate to be there.
Yeah, that's great. So, Father Sam, can you talk a little bit? I mean, your job responsibility as a priest in our community is very large. Walk us through when you got that call. I think we called the church and they put us in touch with you. But when you received that call that Lindsay and I had lost Austin, tell us how you felt in that moment. Have you dealt with that before? So walk us through that a little bit and kind of how you helped us from there.
Yeah. Wow. Well, as a priest, you get a lot of calls about difficult situations and even sometimes really, really tragic situations. But until I got that call from you guys, I had never been called to that kind of a situation. To a child has just died, an infant, nothing like that. I've been there with children who were sick with cancer in the hospital. I've dealt with all that kind of stuff, but it was never anything quite like that. I had done funerals for children at that point, but never anything for a baby. And so, that call, I remember actually my first feeling was just a lot of guilt because I wasn't actually here when you guys called. I don't remember exactly. It was a Monday, right, Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm thinking that I was at a hospital. A lot of times Mondays I would get out and go to the hospital and like visit anybody who was there. And I remember my secretary never calls if I'm like out doing stuff like that. She knows that I've gone off to the hospital. She's like, I would never get a call. And all of a sudden my phone's ringing. I'm going, what is going on? So I answered the phone and she said, I don't know. I couldn't get the name. Here's the phone number. And she gave me your number. And I was on my way back to the parish. So as soon as I got back, I called you guys. And I think that was probably one of the hardest phone calls I've ever been on. Just to talk to you guys and just how raw that whole moment was. Like, Brian, I remember you were telling me what happened, and it was like, I don't know, Lindsay must have been just leaning on you because I just heard her, screaming and wailing. It was awful. I never want to hear anything like that ever again.
Yeah.
But I remember it and just going, all right, I just need to go over there. And so I was just hoping that I would be able to get the address from you. Like I was really nervous that the emotion was so strong that like you might not actually be able to tell me anything. And so I just I got over to the house. And again, I didn't know you. And so Lindsay's now brother-in-law, then boyfriend to her sister, it was the one who opened the door for me. And I was like, I'm not sure who this guy is. I don't know if this is Brian or hi, I'm Father Sam. That was about all I could do. And then of course I met you guys, and I don't really know how do you describe meeting somebody at the absolute worst moment of their life, right? Like how do you really just describe that, capture what's happened there? But I remember sitting with you guys on the couch, and you guys were on either side of me, and you just cried for a while. And it was like, I don't need to say anything right now. I just need to sit with you guys, and let this happen. And then you kind of collected yourselves, which I was really impressed by, because I don't know if I would have been able to do that at all. You collected yourselves, and then you started to tell me what happened. You started to tell me the story of what that whole morning had been for you up to that point. And it was an incredible moment. But I knew as I was sitting there talking with you guys, that basically you would be the only thing I was going to work on for the next week or two. And that was going to be and that sounds like a terrible way to phrase it. But I knew you guys were going to be the main thing that I was dealing with. And honestly, the only thing that really mattered. Everything else, let's take a back seat. There's a family that's lost a baby, and this is so painful. So this has to be the priority.
And I have to say, you touched on something, and we talk about this all the time on the podcast, where obviously you're a priest, but you just listened to us, and I'm sure there are other priests out there that might want to jam scripture and talk to us about all these different things. But in that moment, that's not what Lindsay and I needed. And we always appreciated you for just listening to us. I'm actually kind of numb to a lot of those moments. I'm glad you kind of remember some of them.
Well, I remember a ton from those days.
And you were just such a good listener.
Thank you.
Can we jump in a little bit to, we hear from our listeners all the time about questioning faith when they go through such a traumatic loss. And I just want to dive into that a little bit, and get your perspective on it, because we had a lot of faith, and I would be lying if I said we didn't also have that thought of questioning God and
Same here.
Why us types of questions. So can you just touch a little bit on that, please?
I think it's the most natural question in the world. You know, you're in the darkest moment and the deepest suffering. How do you not ask, like, where is God in this? It's a human question. And so I don't ever object to a question like that. I think it's the most, it's important to recognize that it's there. And like, you could be the person of the deepest faith. You could have no faith at all. And somebody talks about God, and the idea that God is going to allow something like this to happen is offensive, right? Or that this must just be part of some plan. Like, you got to be serious. This is way too painful for something like that. And so there's the reasonable, like, why does something like this happen? And, you know, in the moment of deep personal emotion and connection to the event, you're not aware of the fact that you're touching on the question that philosophers have still not fully grappled with, which is the problem of evil, and why there is, you know, why there is good and why there is bad, why bad things happen. Like, look, this is the question that the philosophers and theologians have been asking since the beginning, since before there was such a thing as Christianity. I mean, like, Aristotle wrestles with this. Like, go to the Greeks; they're dealing with the problem of evil too. It's a totally different thing when you're talking about it theoretically. You know, nice and easy to talk about it as a theory. Totally different thing when you're talking about your own experience. You know, because right there,
Great point.
I always think about your house. I remember, like, the living room is just covered in pictures of you and Lindsay and Colin and Austin, and like, just the joy on the faces. It's nothing but beaming smiles and joy. And so to then step into that place and to be with you guys in that moment, of course the question is, like, how do we lose all this? How did we lose this joy, this beauty, you know? And so I think that question of why would God allow this it's a key question. The answer, right? Like, if your listeners want to know the answer, I'm going to let them down because I don't know the answer. Right? Like,
I was ready to mark a clip, and that was going to be the.
I'm real sorry.
I still did, but it's a good cliffhanger.
I wish that there was an answer. Like, I wish that was something that came easily, but the reality is that the answer to that question, like, why has this happened in my family, and why has God allowed something like this in my family? It's actually going to vary from person to person, right? So the things that come out of something like this. So, like, Brian, I look at what you and Lindsay do for First Candle, and the way that you have now been a presence for other people to bring something to them, to be a support to them. The way, like, the number of people who you guys have brought in, like, when you've had even if it's just on Zoom, doing a little vigil for Austin. And, you know, you've been really kind and allowed me to participate in that a few times. And I'm sorry I missed it this year.
It's okay.
When you guys, like, invite that in, all these faces popping up on the screen from all over the country, from all over the place, all these people who are sharing in that with you. There's lives being touched through that. Now, I can't say that it's so that could happen. But what I can say is that out of the worst possible thing that you guys ever could have experienced, you and Lindsay have been bringing healing to a lot of other people. Like, out of the absolute darkest of days, you guys have changed other people's lives, and in such a beautiful and positive way. So even out of the worst evil, even out of the worst tragedy, there really is always good that can come. And so what I would always want to encourage people is, if you're questioning, if you're doubting, I may not fully be able to grasp and understand exactly the reason for your doubt, because your doubt is rooted in that particular experience that you have. But what I would absolutely urge and encourage and just want to accompany in that time is, like, we have to go through this grief, and I can't explain why, but I know that there's goodness in you, and that goodness in you is going to transform lives.
Wow.
I really appreciate that, Father Sam. I mean, that's really well said. And obviously, we're putting you on the spot with a very complicated question that is very difficult to answer.
Yeah.
You know, talk a little bit about what trust and faith can do for healing, and, for the people out there that feel like they are losing their faith, tell us, why we should, the good that can come from trusting in your faith.
Yeah. I think back to January 21st, 2019, and meeting you and Lindsay for the first time. And something that struck me later was that I met you guys on the worst day of your life. At least I assume that was the worst.
Yes. Yes.
I can't imagine there being a worse day, but obviously, like, who knows what the worst day actually is for someone. But anyway, I met you guys on the worst day, and I look at like how I've been able to interact with you guys since then, and I figure, man, it's gotten better every day. Like,
yeah.
I feel like I've been able to watch you guys through that healing process. But one of the really important things that I see in you guys, and I'm going to use you as the example. One of the really important things is how in the midst of that darkness and just the depth of sadness, you were looking for something. You weren't afraid of being in the dark. You weren't afraid of being in that sadness, right? You understood that you had to deal with it. You had to be in the midst of it. I remember a priest who I knew as a kid, and he would always say that when people are grieving, you have to stand in the grief. You can't jump it over it. You can't run around it. You have to stand in it. And until you've actually been in the grief, and if you're the priest, you've got to be in the grief with them. Until you've actually done that, they can't walk out of the grief. And I really think that that's true. That, you and Lindsay, you stood in that grief and you stayed with it. But as you were in the midst of it, you were also starting to think. You're starting to think, what do I have to do next? What's the next thing? And then in that process, after Austin's funeral, you were surrounded by so many people. And I remember we had this conversation about what happens when everybody goes home. What happens when you don't have everybody in the house anymore? Because for a week and a half, however long it was, you guys had the world in your house. Like you didn't get any time to yourselves because you had so many people always around. So what happens then? And you guys started thinking about that like early on, and you were alert to that and aware of it. And then came all right, what is it that we're looking for? And you invited me into that. And that was a really powerful and sacred thing for me to experience, that you would invite me in, because if I'm talking to somebody who's in the midst of grief, I do want to talk to them about prayer. I do want to talk to them about a relationship with God. I do want to encourage them to faith. It may not be the right move to immediately jump in with that because somebody's in pain. Hear the pain, recognize what the pain looks like, be in that moment with them. But then to start saying, all right, here's the thing that I know how to do. There's an awful lot that I don't know, but I do know how to pray for you, and I know how to pray with you. And so I'm going to invite you to let me pray for you. At the very least, just let me do the praying, and you guys don't even have to join in if you don't want to. But just let me pray for God's grace and favor and blessing for you guys. Let me ask for God to bring healing to this moment and to this sadness, because I know that you need it, and you know that you need it. You may not think that it's something that you want from God, but I know what God can do, and I know how God works in those situations. And then from there, it's all right. As you're looking, as you're reaching for different things, as you're trying to figure out what to do, then it's going to be just the slow invitation. All right. Well, I want to encourage you guys to pray with this. Let's talk to God about that. Let me invite you into the prayer. Even things like paying attention to what's going on around you. Like, what are you noticing about how you're feeling? What are you noticing about the things that are happening as you're going through? And then to say, do you see how this is something that God's giving to you? This is a moment where God's inviting you into something. And a lot of it is just paying attention. Like, where's your heart at right now? And if your heart's not ready to take a deep dive into faith and into belief in God, or into trust, then I can't push you towards that, because I'm going to damage what's already so broken. Right?
What a great point.
Yeah.
I want to ask you. Go
ahead, Brad. Sorry.
No, finish your thought.
Well, so just because I don't want to push you into something doesn't mean that I'm not holding that back and just like waiting for the opportunity. right? Like that's a hugely important thing too, to be like, I got to be ready to have that conversation with you and to encourage you in that direction. So like I look at it as a priest and I say a huge part of what I have to do is to really be praying for you guys in that moment, even more than I'm trying to tell you what to do or do things for you or even get you to a certain point. I've got to be interceding before God for you guys. And if I can do that, if I can dedicate at least a little bit of time each day to praying for you, then there can be, I hope, and I believe, God starts working on things in your own heart, and then again, with you and Brian, with you and Lindsay, rather, I saw how much that was happening, Brian, like to just keep having you guys call and stop in and talk. And just to be able to see how these things were happening. I remember Lindsay talking about the bald eagle.
Yeah, one of the
and
signs.
by Austin's grave. Yeah. And just recognizing that eagle. And it was funny because maybe like a month after, I never told you guys this. I should have told you. A month after I went fishing. I was up at the Farmington River in New Hartford. So like there's nothing out there. You're just on the river. And I'm in the water. I'm like waist deep in the water fishing, and I hear this like screech, and I look up, and this bald eagle comes flying right over me.
Whoa!
Yeah,
Eye level, like right across the stream.
He was like over my head, and came down on the stream.
Oh my God!
30
That's
yards in front of me.
incredible.
It was crazy.
That's awesome.
It was crazy, and I'm standing in the river, and I'm like, Austin, that's really cool.
Oh, thank you.
All the feels right there, Father Sam.
Right?
Seriously, wow.
I do have a
All those
question
things
for
like-
you.
You have that sign, right? You see something there,
Mhm.
and then it starts to remind you. So you see something else, and it reminds you. And like, there's a healing that happens there. Like these little reminders. Like,
Yeah,
you're never going to forget your son. That's never happening. But those little reminders are just beautiful moments where like, this is God just reminding you that you have this gift. You have a gift in Austin, and it's God giving that little reminder and saying like, I'm still here too. It's not just the sign from like from Austin, so to speak, but it's really, that's God at work right there. So when you guys talked about that, I'm like, okay, they're paying attention to what's going on, and that told me a little bit about where you guys were spiritually too.
yeah, that's really well
So,
said.
the power of Brian and Lindsay to seek you out and literally in the darkest hour of their life it's so admirable, and I've always been blown away by the relationship they have with you. Many of our listeners did not seek out your peers, and present company included. What would your advice, Father Sam, be for our listeners that haven't taken that step, but that faith is a part of their life and an important part, but the blame and the sadness and insert whatever other heavy emotion is so strong that they're finding themselves further away from their faith than coming closer to it? What would you say to those people?
I think first, it's not an unusual thing, right? When we feel guilty, especially if there's guilt attached, right? Like that was one of the things you mentioned there, Brad. If there's a feeling of guilt or shame surrounding this, then it's often like, am I good enough to ask God for help in this moment? Right? There's a feeling like, because I feel guilty for this thing happening, which, by the way, is one of the most natural and like normal things that people go through when they're faced with a tragedy. Like the question, what could I have done differently, will always come up, right? So as you're feeling that guilt, you're coming in and trying to figure out what will God do to me or with me. God is mercy, and God wants healing. And so in those places where we're feeling guilt or shame, God doesn't want us to stay in that shadow, right? He doesn't want us to stay in that darkness. He wants us, come on out. Let's talk about it. And we see this again and again. Like, read the Gospels, and what you're going to find is that in those places where people are most ashamed, that's where Jesus goes, and that's where he invites them to something different. And so in that time of real grief and sadness, shame, guilt, whatever might be there, the temptation is to say, I've got to stay in on myself, because there's no way anybody could understand, or there's no way God can help me, or God would want to help me. And it's the exact opposite, but it's counterintuitive. And so I think that the next thing I would say then is, like, recognize that what you're feeling is normal, but don't think for a minute that there's not help available, and that in particular that God doesn't want to be there in that time with you. And so to have somebody reach out and look for help in that moment, to have Brian and Lindsay make that call, one of the really powerful things with it was, I knew that in that time, from that day, I knew that they were open to receiving the things that God wanted them to receive. I didn't know exactly how he was going to give it to them. But, like, just to say, I would encourage, like, open up to that possibility, because there is so much healing that can come. The other part is, honestly, just that relationship with God brings a lot of consolation, because when you give something over to God, when you take that grief, that suffering, that guilt, when you take all of that and you bring that over to God, and you recognize that there's a God who cares for me, then you stop being the sole responsible party. You're not the only one who has to handle this anymore. You don't have to do this alone. And that's the biggest truth.
I literally just got a chill on that one.
I saw your face, bud. I saw it.
Yeah.
Wow.
It does. It gives you a sense of strength
Mm-hmm.
that you didn't have prior. It's such a great point, Father Sam.
Well, when you guys are dealing with grief, what do you feel most of all? Like, as you went through the tragedies that you guys have faced, did you not feel alone? And like there's no way anybody can possibly understand, right?
That and anger.
Yeah. But what happens, like,
Mm-hmm.
the human response, and I think especially for men, like, what we do is we take that on ourselves. Like, I have to deal with this myself. I have to fix this anger that's inside me. I have to deal with this grief, and I'm the only one who can deal with it. Nobody else can do this for me.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain truth to that. Like, you got to deal with your own stuff, right? Nobody can grieve for you. Nobody can like make the grief go away. But then there's this other part, which is, we can't grieve alone. We can't do this alone. We can't heal on our own. Like, we need something else, someone else. And so, you're going to find that in what you guys are doing right here, talking to each other. You're going to find that also really and truly in a relationship with God, that God can enter into that place of darkness, like, and he can take our anger. He can deal with it. He can handle us being mad, and he can handle our blame. But he wants to show us something greater. And so just the encouragement is always going to be, keep searching, keep seeking out that relationship. But never to deny the grief, never to deny the pain that you're in.
Yeah. I think that's so incredible and strong. And I'm so thankful you came on to say these very insightful words to us and to our listeners. And I don't know if you'd feel comfortable, but we have to wrap it up. Yeah. I'd love it if you could even just say a prayer, for Austin, Story, Beckham, and Ari, and all the lost ones for our listeners. I think it would be really nice to, say a prayer before we have to let you go.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. I'm just looking here. I've got my breviary. So the priest, we pray every day from this book, and Austin's in the book every day.
Oh man,
he's right there with me.
Thank you so much. You make me cry.
Same here, dude.
God.
I just called the priest a dude.
I've been called way worse.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Like, I realized, like, if there's anything I could tell you, Brian, I'd want you guys to know just the enormous impact that you and Lindsay have made on me on a personal level too, and that
Thank
Austin's
you.
story and Austin's life has made, even though I only met him after.
Yeah.
And it's been such a blessing to walk with you guys. So I'm
Thank you
super
so
grateful
much,
for you
Father
guys.
Sam.
Yeah.
You mean so much to
Thank
us.
you. We appreciate you. Thank you.
You do.
Yeah. Well, let's give some time to God and let him bring healing here. Lord God, we thank you for the gift of life that you've bestowed upon us. We thank you for the gift of fatherhood that is given. As you are our Father, help us to recognize that even death cannot take away the gift of fatherhood from us. In grief, in sorrow, in shame, in guilt, you are present with us. Help us to know you in all things. Give light to that time of suffering and sadness. Let us see your face and be assured of your closeness to us. We pray for our loved ones, our children, those who have died, that they would be gathered into your arms, safe in your heavenly kingdom. We pray in the hope that we would see them one day again face to face when we are united with you forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
So
you.
beautiful, Father Sam. Thank you. I'm like wiping the tears out.
Yeah,
I mean,
truly.
that was a beautiful prayer,
Thanks,
and I can't wait to tell Lindsay the story about the eagle. She'll love that.
Yeah,
Truly.
I'm all amped up to talk to you guys about this because I first
We
of all,
got maybe we'll have a whole episode on this at some point. I think it could be amazing.
I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and I think it's really important because men in particular need stuff like this.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Thank
what
you.
you're doing.
God
You're
bless.
amazing,
God
and
bless you. Thank you.
I'll see you soon.
All right.
And if
Thanks,
anybody any of our listeners want to reach Father Sam, reach out to us, and we can send you his contact. He's a great resource if anybody has any questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Father Sam.
Cool. You got it.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye.
guys.
Well, that was incredibly powerful, and continuing on with an unbelievable part of this conversation, incredibly excited to welcome a dear friend of mine, Dr. Jason Fernasiak. Jason, how are you, bud?
Woo! Thank you for joining us.
Hey.
I'm doing well, Brad. It's good to be on the podcast, and it's an honor.
We're so excited to have you, honestly. And I think at some points in time through life, you've met both Brandon and Brian, certainly at the wedding and probably Ashton's birthday. And
Yep.
as you know, we've been on this pretty incredible journey here together. And we just wrapped a roughly 30-minute conversation with the pastor that supported Brian through his grief and loss of his son, Austin. And so we've kind of covered that angle. But a lot of what we talk about with other men through this podcast, both our guests and that we hear from people through our social media channels, is the medical community. And so we wanted to give a moment for you to introduce yourself and sort of your background and credentials, and then we'll jump into a couple topics here.
Sure. Well, again, I'm Dr. Jason Fernasiak. Jason is fine, and I'm a board certified obstetrician and gynecologist, and I have subspecialty board certification as a reproductive endocrinology and infertility physician. And I have additional board certification as a high complexity laboratory director and andrology laboratory director, which means that I oversee what goes on in the IVF laboratory. And I also oversee what goes on in the andrology laboratory, which is essentially the diagnosis and workup of male factor infertility. I work at a fertility clinic in southern New Jersey, where I'm the lead physician and the laboratory director of the clinic.
Wow. I just feel so inferior to Jason every time we meet him.
Man.
How many degrees do you have?
I went through training. It was a very long journey through school. I did undergrad. I did medical school. I did 4 years of residency, And then beyond the 4 years of residency, did 3 years of subspecialty training, during which time I got the board certification as an OBGYN, the board certification as an REI, and during the 3-year fellowship, I got the board certification as the laboratory director.
So I think we got the right guy for the pod.
Yeah.
And just for listeners, Jason's wife, Caitlin, was the maid of honor in our wedding. So I've talked about the unbelievable relationship with Brian and Brandon, obviously, and I've referenced Jason actually in a pod or two before about having this incredible sort of ace up our sleeve for us when we were going through all of our challenges. And Jason's been an unbelievable resource for Jessica and I. So, Doc, thanks for joining us. I've never called you that before, and I don't think I've
It didn't look comfortable.
it didn't feel natural. One of the questions off the top that we wanted to talk to you about is, a lot of the times that we're hearing from these other men, and frankly, you and I have had this conversation, is families that have gone through loss are looking for an answer as to why. And, they often don't turn to faith because they know they're not going to get, that God may not come down and give them that exact answer. And so oftentimes they probably look to the medical community. Mm-hmm. And I know you probably don't always have answers, right? And every situation is unique and different. More from a general perspective, what is that like for you as a doctor and going through these conversations? And what are some of the questions that you most frequently get from families looking to sort of satisfy that why answer they're looking for?
Sure. There are couples who see me very frequently in the clinic who have had pregnancy losses. And in fact, in my subspecialty, one of the groups of patients that I very frequently see are patients that have a diagnosis of recurrent pregnancy loss. And that typically is having 2 or 3 clinically recognized pregnancy losses. And so a lot of these folks coming in are physically and emotionally drained from this process that they've been through. And they really want answers. And, I always talk with couples about it, and I try to do my best to put it in context to some degree. I think that pregnancy loss, and I applaud this podcast for doing so, but pregnancy loss is not something that people really talk freely about. But it's very common. As it turns out, about 15% of clinically recognized pregnancies, so these would be pregnancies seen on an ultrasound, about 15% of those will end up resulting in a pregnancy loss. And so it is, unfortunately, quite common. And there are actually a number of things that we do think about when it comes to couples that are having pregnancy loss. There's a kind of standard workup that we look at, some blood testing, some imaging studies that we do. But even with all of this, about 50% of patients or couples that have recurrent pregnancy loss will end up with a very unsatisfying diagnosis of unexplained recurrent pregnancy loss. And it's very unsatisfying for the couples, and it's very unsatisfying for the clinicians that are caring for them. I will say the one kind of silver lining to this somewhat appearing dark cloud is that patients who have recurrent pregnancy loss, particularly those that don't have an explanation, have a very, very good prognosis in terms of being able to successfully conceive and build their family in the future.
That is a light at the end of a very, very dark tunnel. Appreciate that perspective. How do you find
statistics are? I just wanted to point out the statistics. Like, you don't realize it seems more common. I would have guessed a lower percentage,
Yeah, that's 1 out of 7.
7. Yep.
Yeah.
And it's
yeah.
literally, 7 pregnant people in a room, it's pretty unbelievable when you think of it that way. And certainly not 1 out of 7 people are talking about this.
Yeah, it makes you feel a little bit less alone when you're going through something like that, because that's an obvious feeling when, it's just not working.
Jason, what are you finding from... Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, these are clinically recognized pregnancies.
Good point.
For patients who have positive pregnancy tests, for example, there can be as much as, the estimates are as much as 30 to 60% of all conceptions. So when an egg and sperm meet, 30 to 60% of conceptions will end up having a loss before the end of the first trimester. So I always kind of talk to patients and let them know that, as it turns out, human beings are not too terribly good at doing this, and sometimes it does take some time.
Jason, where do you see the man's stance in a lot of this? Do you find that they are talking to you about these things? Is it usually the wife? Because obviously you're probably spending more time doing what you're doing. With Jessica and I going through IVF, she was going to more appointments than I could. Some of that was also COVID based. But do you find that men are engaging these conversations? Do you find that they're standing off? What's the doctor's perspective?
Well, I think, I thought a lot about this as we were preparing to talk this evening. And, I think that there is, in my mind, 2 different ways that I see men interacting in terms of the fertility world that I deal with. The first part is couples that are coming to see me because they can't get pregnant, so having fertility troubles. And one of the things that stands out, again, I will say these are generalizations, so there's always certainly subsets that don't follow this rule, but as a generalization, women have a much easier time medicalizing infertility. So in other words, if something is found to be awry with a woman's reproductive system, say they have too few eggs in their ovary or diminished ovarian reserve, women are much more able to medicalize that and say, oh, this is a medical problem that I have, and we can try to tackle this with treatments.
Good point.
Whereas men take a lot of the infertility side of things very personally. They internalize it, and it becomes a little bit about their sense of manhood. So if, as opposed to women having too few eggs, if a man has too few sperm, they have a little bit of difficulty medicalizing that and seeing that as a medical problem, and they oftentimes internalize it and see it as a impact on how they see themselves as a man. The other
right. I'm sorry to cut you off, but
that's
man,
awesome.
That is right on the head. Absolutely. Wow.
Pun intended, Brandon?
Pun intended.
All right, yeah, we're still a little boys at heart.
Oh,
at least
gosh.
I am. So there was a second part to that, Jason?
Yeah. So the other side of it is how men approach pregnancy loss or recurrent pregnancy loss. I think that oftentimes, again, as a generalization, the women are allow themselves to be a lot more emotionally vulnerable when it comes to talking about the pregnancy loss. They do attempt to, or they're more likely to reach out and seek help, particularly when it comes to, we have counselors available and mental health folks available, and women oftentimes take advantage of those things, whereas men really tend to be much less vocal. They appear to be much less engaged. and oftentimes really don't kind of wear their emotions a little bit more visibly, like women do. And so, I think to some degree that can sometimes leave men being a little bit perhaps marginalized when it comes to the resources available for emotional support when it comes to pregnancy loss.
Man, you're literally spot on, and
Yeah.
I guess you're coming off so comfortable with it, and I think that's a question that we're all having. Like, doctors nowadays, is it becoming normalized for pregnancy loss? Or is that like a thing that's just like, are you becoming so numb to it because it's happening, so often? Like, how are you guys, maneuvering yourselves through this, the loss of another child, so on and so forth?
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a couple of parts to that answer, Brandon. One of them is what it's like for me to see a couple that's coming to me for recurrent pregnancy loss. So they've already had their pregnancy losses. I see at least 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 or 5 couples a week who are coming to me with this issue. And again, my specialty focuses on this. So obviously I get referred a lot of patients who have this issue. And I think it's always important for me, even though I have heard a version of this story, I hear a version of this story 4 or 5 times a week. And I know based upon their intake that they write out for me, almost exactly what I'm going to do, what I'm going to look for. It's going to be essentially the same thing. It's always really important to me to allow them to tell me in their own words what they've been through. So I always start my consult by saying, I've had the chance to look at your intake paperwork. I understand that you've not really had trouble getting pregnant, but it's kind of staying pregnant that seems to be the trouble. I always like to hear patients tell me in their own words what it is that they've been through. And I just am quiet for usually about 10 or 15 minutes as they tell me their story. And it allows them to say aloud what it is that they've been through. And I think in some way that kind of from the emotional side of things can help with some of the healing process to be able to say some of these things out loud. So I think from that standpoint, that's one of the ways that I try to maintain the ability to have it not be a numb thing, as you mentioned. And I think the other factor, rather than patients coming to me with pregnancy loss, are patients who are mine already that experience a pregnancy loss.
Good point.
So, the other side of what I do, I don't deal with just pregnancy loss. I deal with infertility in general. And as we mentioned, 30 to 60% on some, depending on what statistics you look at, of pregnancies that occur. So the egg and sperm meet and you have a positive pregnancy test, don't end up resulting in a pregnancy. So I care for patients all of the time that are having and experiencing pregnancy loss. And one of the things that, and I'll say from that standpoint, you never ever get numb to that. It's always something that is really emotionally challenging for folks. And it, no matter how many times you see it, it's the first time it's happening to that person.
Wow. Do you get yelled at a lot by your patients?
It's a great question. I was thinking something similar.
Do you focus on the science if there's just, not like yelling going on, or they just
do they want to blame you?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, rare. I've actually really very rarely had a patient get very angry directly with me. Oftentimes, they will be quite angry with the situation. And I think that sometimes can very frequently happen. I think that frustration that is only natural when we have something in life that we don't have an explanation for, whether it be pregnancy loss or any number of things. I think that there are a range of emotions there that people go through. There's sadness and despair. There's anger. You think about the Kubler-Ross stages of grieving. So there are a number of different things that people go through when they're grieving, and I think that you have to allow patients to go through those stages in order to be able to be made whole again.
Yeah, and I think, Jason, a big part of what we've been hearing from our guests and listeners is, the importance of compassion from doctors through a lot of this. And I think, the fact that you probably haven't been yelled at all too much is maybe a testament to the fact that you're an unbelievably compassionate person. And I can speak firsthand to that. And sure, people may say, well, yeah, he's your wives are best friends. And ipso facto, you're incredibly close. But I never felt that you were only compassionate just because you were a close friend. You also gave us very compassionate perspective from a medical point of view. And I think that makes you really special in this space. So, really thankful for you in our lives.
That's thank you very much for that, Brad. It means a lot.
Thank you. Jason, I know we're wrapping up into time here. Any additional thoughts or anything else that you think guys out there should know?
Well, I think that when it comes to guys being involved with, the process of pregnancy loss, I would really just encourage guys to the degree that you're comfortable, be emotionally available. I think being emotionally available to your partner is an important thing, but also being willing and able to reach out if you need help. I think that there's a tendency to try to essentially be the man and be the rock and be the one who is strong. I think that there are certainly times for that, but it doesn't have to be all the time. And I think it's okay to feel emotions as a result of a very emotional thing happening.
Such a great point.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's why we created this podcast, Jason. Yeah. Honestly, we all have admitted on this at certain points in time of we all had to be the man, the rock, that steadfast part of our family. And then we realized the burden and the weight that was putting on us, and we didn't have the outlets to manifest our own grief. And so you bring up such a great perspective. And, I think a lot of men, even though they know it, a lot of times just hearing it again is a great affirmation of the importance.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for your insight.
You definitely turned over the page. Thank you, Jason, my man. Oh, man.
Absolutely. Well, Brandon and Brian and Brad, it was a huge honor to be a part of the podcast. What you all are doing is, I think, immensely impactful for a lot of guys out there. I think that that given the following you have, but I really do commend you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Jason.
Well, thank you for everything you're doing.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Give my love to Caitlin, and we'll talk soon, okay?
All right. Take care now, guys.
Doctor.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Dr. Jason Franasiak.
Bye now.
And now to round out our conversation, incredibly honored to have somebody who's been near and dear to mine and my wife Jessica's heart over the past couple of years, Pamela Pressler, licensed clinical social worker and partners with Emma's Footprints. Pam, how are you?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for
Thanks
having
for joining
me.
us.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for joining.
And we just saw you like a week and a half ago.
Yeah, at the gala. We had our,
It was
Heck yeah.
an unbelievable event.
it was
Beautiful
amazing.
So Pam, we want to give you an opportunity to just introduce yourself, your credentials, and a little bit about your background.
Okay, so I am, as Brad said, a licensed clinical social worker. I'm in private practice in Erie, Pennsylvania. I specialize in grief, and I'm also a relationship specialist. So what that means is that I spend part of my time in my practice helping couples in premarital relationship, couples, marital work, and I do a coaching approach and parenting as well. And then I also spend the other majority of my time, the other half of my time, doing infant and pregnancy loss work with individuals and couples as well, which has really morphed into all types of grief work. And the interesting piece about that is that the grief work really applies through my entire practice, because not only is there grief, as you all know, being on here, in infant and pregnancy loss, there's also grief in relationships breaking down, job loss, losing parents. It's just, there's all different types of grief, but really the feelings, the components of it are all the same. That said, I also specialize in infant and pregnancy loss, so I'm certified in perinatal loss care, which is a specialization that therapists can apply for and not many have. And so I like to speak to that because I think we need more of me. So
Amen, sister.
Can you say it louder for the people in the back?
Yeah, that's right.
Jeez.
Pam, and real quick, how'd you get involved with Emma's?
So really interesting story. I don't know if any of you know this, so I'm going to try to make it quick for you. The longer story is about 15 years ago, I moved to Erie with my family. At that point, I had all my clinical training done, but I was a stay-at-home mom for a stint. And we had moved here and we're having some work done in our backyard on a retaining wall. And all of a sudden, the person who was working on the retaining wall went missing, just dropped off from the job, right? And so my husband and I, being new to the area, we're like, oh my goodness, where is this person? So like any person who had paid a lot of money to have something done, started making phone calls. And a family member finally responded to the calls and said, we're really sorry about this, but the person who's been working on your retaining wall and his wife were pregnant and she just lost their baby. And I said, okay, well, please let them know that I'm a therapist, and if they need anything, I'm happy to help. And I never heard anything. So fast forward 7 years, and I was called by Tracy Daly, who was very new into the whole Emma's thing. And she said, hey, I heard about you from another person, another client that's worked with you, and I've heard really good things. And I'd like to meet with you to talk with you about possibly helping our families. And so she and I met for lunch at Panera, and she was telling me all about her story and telling me about her grief journey, which had just really started at that point because there were no services for families who had had losses. And as she was telling me her story, it just kind of like flooded my brain. And she said, I said to her, I said, wait a minute, what is your name? And she said, Tracy. And I said, what's your last name? And she said, Daly. And I said, is your husband Brian? And she said, yes. And I said, Brian was working on my retaining wall when you lost Emma. And
talk about a sign.
So I said, okay, sign me up. Whatever you want me to do, I'll do. And so immediately, as soon as she asked me to do that, I said, oh, and by the way, can I be on your board? And she said, where did you come from?
And can he come over and finish on my retaining wall too?
Yeah,
That
how was his work? Because he was a guest of ours. So
that's right.
So we really, it's awesome. But I have just been it's been wonderful because I've been able to be so creative in helping families and just develop things that have been helpful to them. And so in partnering with Emma's, we've been able to create all these different resources and things available for families, which hopefully we can talk a little bit about.
Absolutely. And Pam, you are so incredible, and the services that you provide to Jessica and I and to so many families. I know you speak, somewhat frequently on the Emma's pod as well. For us, taking this conversation for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, specifically down the men's path, what are you seeing from your perspective from grieving fathers that have gone through this loss? are they engaging with you? Are they hesitant with you? What are some of the things that you're seeing most predominantly when, with the men in this
Well, I
space?
appreciate you asking, and it's really awesome timing because I was just having this conversation yesterday. I am such a huge advocate for fathers, first of all. I always have been. In my other
Thank you.
in my other work, I do a lot of high conflict. I did previously. I try not to. A lot of high conflict co-parenting work and those things. So I work a lot with the courts to try to create unified parenting teams for children. And notoriously and historically, fathers have kind of been kept on the periphery. And so I'm a huge advocate for the value of dads in their children's lives, whether they have living children or they have deceased children. And so what I've been seeing primarily is that when I started doing this work really 7 years ago, I could not get dads to come in. And more importantly, I tried to start a men's group and it just didn't happen. And so what I did as far as my programming was I started to create retreats, couples retreats for couples reconnecting after loss. And fathers were coming into the retreat, and because the wives would say, I really want you to go, this is really about us connecting. And in these small groups, we're finally starting to open up. And so the reason why I say that, and the reason that's so important is because, and I just spoke to this, like I said yesterday, most fathers, when I meet them, because now they come in with their wives into my office, and I do a lot of kind of couples marital stuff as well as the grief stuff at the same time in my office. But a lot of dads will say to me, and the kind of the theme is I just didn't want to do anything because I didn't want to upset my wife or the mother of my child any more than she already was. I just was paralyzed. I just kept to myself, which is so understandable.
I think I said that to you, Pam.
I think everybody's said that. That's been in my office to me. And I see that and I recognize it and I try to speak to it right out of the gate with moms when they're saying to me, I feel like he doesn't care. I feel like he's not as connected to the baby as I was. And I say, yes, he is. He's just right now, his mode is, how do I protect the family I have left? How do I keep them safe? Because I feel so sad about the family that I've lost. And so when I can kind of level that playing field a little bit more, it's just such a beautiful thing to watch couples start to come together and connect on that. And I think also just having this amazing lost community, what you gentlemen have done, it's just been on my heart for so many years. And I just want to, if I can say out loud too, and I've been speaking to this a lot too, and I say someday I'm going to write a dissertation on this and a man's perspective. You know, a lot of my work is empathizing with the people with whom I work. And what really has come across to me is that as women who are experiencing a loss, they may be in so much pain, they may be having medical procedures, they may be medicated so heavily that they don't even really realize what's going on at the time of their loss, right? But fathers and the men involved are typically very clear-minded, not in pain physically, not sedated, and are standing there watching it makes me want to cry, it gives me goosebumps, watching their wives or mothers of their children in so much pain and their babies dying or deceased, and there's nothing they can do. Nothing. Mm-hmm. And to marginalize that experience or to overlook that experience to me is I just won't let it happen because I just think it's so important, and I want people to know that that's what dads have to go through when they're losing their child.
We appreciate
so
you
powerful.
even going out the box on that. Yeah,
so incredibly sad. Yeah, I have a question for you, Pam. And I've talked about this on previous podcasts, and we've sort of dove into therapy recently. Therapy really didn't work out initially for my wife, Lindsay, and I think the first therapist we had, I don't know, was the right fit. And we've heard from some other guests where you should keep trying to find that therapy or somebody to talk to that is the right fit. And I think for me personally, that first therapist I had the thought of, she hasn't gone through a loss that we went through. You know, she didn't lose a baby. And I think, again, it was very early after we lost our son, Austin. But I almost felt like resentful, like she doesn't understand me. I'm not going to take advice or anything from somebody that hasn't been in that position. Can you just talk a little bit to some of the dads that might have gone through the same thing with me, or just even finding the right fit? Or, you know, obviously I wish I had you or known you. But I think obviously what you're doing can be really helpful to dads.
So the one thing I just want to kind of put out there into the universe is that when we are trained as clinicians, we're trained that you don't bare your soul about anything pertaining to you unless you think it's going to help your clients. So that would be at a therapist's discretion whether or not they want to share that. So I want to say that to help educate people, because you don't know that person didn't have a loss. In fact, I would say most therapists who do this work have probably had a loss, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. So that's just a little bit of understanding, because people don't know that. We are taught you don't share anything because you're there for your client. And if you share, then it's like a lack of boundaries, and it appears to be unhealthy. And so there's a knack and a tact that comes with doing that in a healthy way, right? So I wouldn't want anybody to go down that assumption street that person didn't have a loss, right? And so there's that. The other thing I would say is that, you know, I am a therapist. I'm clinically trained. I will tell you that my approach to working with grieving families is not a therapeutic or clinical approach. My approach is very much more from a human approach. Everybody grieves. We are all going to grieve in our lifetime. I don't personally believe, and I may have some people who disagree with me on this, I don't believe that's something that is reflective of a mental health diagnosis, which is required to bill insurance and the medical companies, because I don't think anybody has a mental illness when they're grieving the loss and death of their child. I think they have grief, and I think that's something different. And so I hope that when people walk into a room and start sharing, you know, when guys want to come in and start sharing, you can always ask to go meet with a therapist and decide you don't want to work with them. You don't have to attach to them. In fact, I often give pre-consults. That's not common, but I often do, especially for dads, because it gives them a place to feel like, I want to talk to this person and see if I gel with them or not, right? I'm fortunate because I think just the way I approach men is a little bit different, and I think that they can feel that sometimes. But I think that if you know that you can go in and talk to somebody and, you know, just kind of feel them out. I mean, you're going in there to share one of the most sacred parts of your life. You have the right to go in and decide if that's the person you want to share it with.
You know, that like never crossed my mind, and like such a good point. It's like, you know, buying a car. Yeah, I know I've got every option. I can walk off the lot and not purchase this car if I'm not interested. You know, to share the worst moments of our lives with, it's sort of like, here's your therapist and go tell that person. And I never even fathomed the fact of choice.
And as a man, like if you don't gel with the first therapist, I feel like sometimes you just get this thing, well, therapy's not for me.
Great point. Shut it down.
Great. Maybe let's talk to somebody else. So it's such a great point that I think is really helpful to our listeners.
So Pam, I guess, what are some of the most common issues you're finding when you're having, you know, families, you know, couples come in, you know, to see you after losing a child? Is it, you know, to speak of divorce? Is it family issues? Is it intimacy? You know, let our listeners know.
I really appreciate that question, Brandon. And this is where I think, you know,
you're welcome.
Sometimes you just kind of find your calling and fall into your calling in the most random ways. But so I feel like what I see is that when couples come in and they've had a loss, not only are they completely paralyzed in grieving the loss of their child and the loss of the lifetime of their child in their family constellation, oftentimes the strain, because that's such a strain on us, we go into self-preservation mode. So it's kind of hard to worry about what the person next to you is thinking and feeling, right? At times, because it's just a fight or flight situation. You're just trying to tread water emotionally. But what I find is that oftentimes, whatever, even minor breakdowns, because we all have them in our relationships from time to time, but whatever minor breakdowns or dynamics that were occurring previously, now they get amped up, because now all my pain is coming out, and I'm not coping in the healthiest ways, because who can? You can barely get up and take a shower sometimes, right? And so because of my couples coaching work that I do, and because of my expertise in grief and loss, I'm able to merge those two things. And that's where the retreats come in. And that's where the couples work that I do in my office comes in, because I'm able to kind of, temper the relationship piece as well as the grief piece. I can tell you, in 7 years of doing this and the hundreds of families I've seen, knock on wood, I have not had one divorce yet. That is a goal of mine.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
excellent.
And actually, I was selected for the Stillbirth Summit. I don't know if you know about the Stillbirth Summit. It's in San Diego this year in June, and it's a research group that does a huge presentation on grief and loss and all the things, and all medical people. So I got chosen to do a poster presentation on the retreats that I do and the couples work I'm doing, because, to answer your question very long-windedly, one of the primary concerns I hear from people, from couples, is we're afraid of what this is going to do to our relationship. Help us, because we're afraid and we don't know how. And like, we may have struggled communicating before, now we're really struggling. Or kind of like I had said initially, the husbands or fathers don't know what to do with their wives because they're so broken and so emotional, and it's not in their comfort zone to deal with those emotions. And the wives feel disconnected from their husbands because their husbands have just locked down because they're afraid to show any emotion to make the situation worse. So when I start talking about that and really start diving into that and giving both people tools that they can actually go home and do to help them feel more grounded in their grief, then I see them start, letting go of white knuckling and leaning into one another. And it's a beautiful thing.
So Pam, as we start to wrap up here, I think we could, we said this with Father Sam and Dr. Jason, these could all be individual episodes. I want to ask you a same question that I asked Father Sam. And obviously from a different perspective here, but same question makes sense. Yeah, I asked him, for those that have not gone and made the move to pursue their faith and get back to their faith, what was his advice? And for you, for the men listening that just have automatically said therapy is not for me, or, like Brian tried once and it wasn't the right thing and moved on. Unfortunately, Father Sam has filled a lot of that void for Brian. What would your advice be to the men out there listening that, haven't gone down that pathway, but there's a ton of value there for them?
I would say that even more important to leading people to wanting to be vulnerable enough to work on themselves in that way is joining a lost community. When you do your podcasts and you put them out to the universe, you have just touched somebody in a way that nobody else can, because a man who is fearful, which it's often fear-based, can access that and have his emotions and be vulnerable when no one else is around. And so connecting with other men and connecting with other people who have had similar experiences is a first step toward healing and finding your way to somebody like me who can help. Like you said, Brad, I've done other podcasts for Emma's Footprints. A lot of my podcasts for them have been sharing a lot of my tools and the things that I've developed to help families. So I encourage people, if they're not in therapy yet and they want to have some help, that they can always access those for free on Emma's. And I'm always happy to do some with you as well. But I would say lean into your lost community first, because the men that came to the retreats, the men that I've been interacting with, that's where it started for them. That's where it started, is when they've joined with other men for the most part. And now I see it. I can go do this now. It's not such a wimpy thing or a scary thing to do it.
It's a great point. Fellas, you don't have to sprint to it, but take a step, right? Take that first step towards your healing path.
Tag that.
Well, Pam,
Yeah,
we are so
your
blessed.
schedule, Pam, because I
Yeah.
want to.
Shoot me an email, Brian, if you have my email address. Brad can give it to you.
I definitely will. Pam, you're
Thank
incredible. Jessica and I are so lucky to have you in our lives. Guys in Grief is so lucky. Emma's Footprints is so lucky. As Jessica and I said on stage a couple weeks ago, we would not be here without the support of you and Emma's. And I hope you just were able to provide that same level of support to all of our listeners here today and find a lot of value out of the services that you and your colleagues out in the world provide. So we're so blessed.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Pam.
you. And thanks for the
Thank you,
kind
Pam.
words. I really appreciate it.
Really insightful.
Our
Deserve
pleasure.
them.
Well, thank you to Father Sam, to Dr. Jason, and to Pam Pressler. Guys, that was unbelievable, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think we need like a clap audio or something like
That
that
was
to applaud
special.
them. That
I
was
mean-
beautiful. Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, just to get the different perspectives on all those issues as it pertains to men, I think was so incredible and really opened my eyes to a lot of different, points of view.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and understanding that if you've gone down, the seeking your faith perspective or seeking and needing the medical support or therapy, it was powerful hearing similar conversations from very different expertise and perspectives. So I think we found probably new episodes down each of these avenues at some point in time, but this collective conversation was pretty powerful.
Hey, random thought. Was Pam our first female guest?
She was. Good call out, Brandon.
Wow.
Good call.
Thanks, Pam.
Shout out to
Thank you,
Pam.
Well, listeners, and we know this was a little bit of a longer episode, but the power of it, we hope, was worth your time and investment. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time.
Love you guys.
Love you guys.
Love you, fellas.